Everyone thinks Bruce Lee copied Muhammad Ali. They're wrong. Lee's real teacher was a 160-pound boxer who retired before they ever met. A fighter so systematic, Bruce Lee spent hundreds of hours stealing his secrets frame by frame. This is the story no one talks about. Los Angeles, November 1967. Bruce Lee sat alone in his study at 628 Gailey Avenue, heavy curtains drawn against the California afternoon sun. The room was dark, except for the narrow beam cutting through air from a 16 film projector. On the small screen, grainy black and white footage flickered with the mechanical rhythm of old celluloid. The boxer on screen moved like water. His name was Sugar Ray Robinson, and Bruce Lee was about to steal everything he knew. Most people assume Bruce Lee studied Muhammad Ali. Both men were fast revolutionary, ahead of their time. When journalists wrote about Bruce Lee in the late 1960s, Ali comparisons appeared regularly. The connection seemed obvious, but obvious connections are often wrong. Bruce Lee admired Ali, respected his speed, his showmanship, his ability to make boxing look like performance art. But admiration and systematic study were different things entirely. When Bruce Lee needed to understand how a smaller man could consistently defeat larger opponents, when he needed to decode the mechanics of efficient movement, he went further back, much further back, to Sugar Ray Robinson, the man who had retired before Bruce Lee became internationally famous, the man who never knew he was being analyzed, frame by frame in a darkened room in Los Angeles, the man whose fighting principles would fundamentally reshape how Bruce Lee understood combat. This is not a story about two fighters meeting. They never did. Robinson was finishing his legendary career, as Bruce Lee was beginning his journey into martial arts philosophy. But through film, through obsessive analysis, Bruce Lee absorbed more from Robinson than he ever learned from any living teacher. The education began in Oakland, December 1964. Bruce Lee had just finished his most important fight against Wong Jack Man. He won, but it took too long. The victory felt like defeat. Bruce Lee had expected to end the fight in seconds. Instead, he found himself winded after 3 minutes, his techniques failing against an opponent who wouldn't cooperate with his assumptions. That night, Bruce Lee wrote, "My technique is sound, but incomplete. Against a moving target, I become just another fighter. This cannot be." Evolution required understanding what actually worked in combat. He needed to study the most effective fighters in history, regardless of discipline. That search led him to professional boxing. Boxing offered something martial arts often lacked: objective measurement of effectiveness. Boxers fought regularly against serious opposition. Their techniques were tested under maximum pressure. Most importantly, their methods were documented on film. Bruce Lee began acquiring boxing footage systematically: professional fights, training footage, sparring sessions. He converted a corner of his Los Angeles home into a private screening room, complete with projection equipment and note-taking materials. But he wasn't interested in every boxer. He was looking for specific qualities: fighters who succeeded despite physical disadvantages, men who won through technique rather than power. That criteria led him to Sugar Ray Robinson. Robinson had been retired for several years by 1967, but his reputation among boxing historians was unquestioned. Pound for pound, many considered him the greatest fighter who ever lived. But what captured Bruce Lee's attention wasn't Robinson's reputation, it was his method. Bruce Lee acquired every piece of Robinson footage he could locate: professional fights, training footage, sparring sessions. He set up the projection equipment in his study and began the analytical process that would define his approach to martial arts. He didn't watch fights for entertainment. He dissected them for education. Robinson moved differently than other boxers of his era. Most fighters relied on planted feet and power punching. Robinson was smaller, more economical, never wasting energy. Every step served a tactical purpose. Every punch was thrown from the optimal position. Here was a man who weighed 160 pounds, consistently defeating fighters 20 or 30 pounds heavier through superior understanding of combat mechanics. Bruce Lee watched the footage obsessively, studying how Robinson controlled distance and created angles that made opponents' size advantages irrelevant. Bruce Lee began taking detailed notes. The notes weren't about copying Robinson's style exactly. Bruce Lee understood boxing had inherent limitations, but the underlying principles were universal. Distance control, angular movement, economic use of energy. These concepts could be adapted to any fighting system. At this point, Bruce Lee wasn't studying boxing anymore. He was reverse engineering combat itself, and he didn't keep it private. Dan Inosanto, one of Bruce Lee's closest students, later described how Bruce would put on boxing films during training sessions. Bruce would stop the film and say, "Watch how he controls the distance here," Inosanto recalled. Most of the time it was Sugar Ray Robinson footage. Bruce studied that man like he was reading a textbook. Bruce Lee wasn't asking how Robinson won. He was asking why everyone else lost the same way. The breakthrough came while analyzing footage of Robinson's 1951 rematch with Jake LaMotta. LaMotta was bigger, stronger, younger than Robinson. He had beaten Robinson once before through sheer pressure and volume punching. But in the rematch, Robinson dismantled LaMotta systematically. Bruce Lee watched the sequence dozens of times. Let's break down exactly what he saw. Round 3, 2 minutes 45 seconds. Robinson establishing distance with his jab. Notice the angle, not straight ahead, but from the outside, creating a corridor of space. 7 seconds later, Robinson's pivot. Watch his left foot, 45-degree angle. LaMotta's pressure is now hitting empty air. Robinson has turned a power disadvantage into a positional advantage. Look at the feet. Specifically, the pivot. Bruce Lee would tell his students. Robinson pivots to escape the corner. 20 years later, Lee uses the exact same pivot to set up a sidekick. This isn't inspiration. This is a photocopy. It was like watching a chess master play against an enthusiastic amateur. Robinson wasn't just winning through physical superiority. He was thinking several moves ahead, controlling the entire engagement through positioning and timing. Bruce Lee realized he was watching something that transcended boxing technique. This was systematic combat thinking. But there was another element that resonated with Bruce Lee's developing philosophy. Robinson never used more force than necessary. He was capable of tremendous power, but he didn't rely on power as his primary weapon. He used precision. This concept would become central to Bruce Lee's development of Jeet Kune Do. Years later, the idea that effectiveness didn't require maximum effort, that proper technique and timing could accomplish more than raw strength. Robinson had shown Bruce Lee that true mastery lay not in overwhelming opponents, but in understanding them so completely that their strength became irrelevant. Bruce Lee began incorporating Robinson's movement principles into his training, experimenting with different adaptations over months of testing, not the exact techniques, but the underlying concepts. Gradually, a new approach began emerging. Bruce Lee's fighting stance evolved. Instead of the traditional Wing Chun centerline position, he began experimenting with what he eventually called the strong side forward stance. This was similar to Robinson's southpaw boxing stance, modified for martial arts contexts. His footwork changed dramatically. Robinson's influence made him more tactical in movement. Every step began serving a specific purpose. Movement became about controlling engagement distance, rather than displaying speed. Most significantly, Bruce Lee's understanding of timing underwent a fundamental shift. Robinson had demonstrated that the fastest fighter didn't necessarily win. The fighter with superior timing did. There was something else Bruce Lee recognized in Robinson's movement: rhythm. Before martial arts, Bruce Lee had been a cha-cha champion in Hong Kong. He understood how rhythm could control space. Robinson moved like a dancer, not flashy, but with an internal metronome that controlled every exchange. This wasn't coincidence. Robinson had trained as a dancer before boxing. These concepts began appearing in Bruce Lee's teaching at his Los Angeles school. Students started learning footwork patterns that bore no resemblance to traditional martial arts. Ted Wong, one of his students, became his testing ground. Bruce would position me exactly like Lamada, Wong recalled. Heavy forward pressure. Then he'd show me what Robinson did. The first time Bruce Lee applied Robinson's pivot against Ted's rush, Ted found himself punching air while Bruce had moved to his side, perfectly positioned. It wasn't magic, Wong remembered. It was geometry. Robinson had figured out the math of fighting. When students asked about the origins of these techniques, Bruce Lee would mention studying boxing footage, but he rarely specified which boxers. The Robinson influence remained largely invisible. The clearest expression appeared not in his teaching, but in his films. The fighting choreography in movies like Fist of Fury and Enter the Dragon demonstrated clear adaptations of Robinson's movement principles. The way Bruce Lee circled opponents, the way he used lateral movement to create striking opportunities, the way he controlled engagement distance throughout combat sequences. All of it traced back to those hours studying Robinson's footage in his darkened study. But the influence extended beyond technique. Robinson had shown Bruce Lee a different way of conceptualizing combat entirely. Instead of trying to overpower opponents, control them through superior positioning. Instead of using maximum force, apply optimal force at the correct moment. These concepts became the philosophical foundation of Jeet Kune Do. Bruce Lee's martial art was often described as a philosophy rather than a technical system, but the practical applications were rooted in lessons learned from Sugar Ray Robinson's boxing method. The irony was profound. Robinson never knew about his influence on martial arts history. Bruce Lee occasionally mentioned in interviews that he would like to meet Robinson someday, but the meeting never materialized. When Bruce Lee died suddenly in Hong Kong in July 1973, Robinson was still alive, living in relative obscurity. The connection between the two fighters existed only in Bruce Lee's notes and in the techniques he had passed on to his students. Those notes, discovered among Bruce Lee's papers after his death, revealed the extent of his Robinson study. In these archives, Robinson's name appears 47 times across 12 different notebooks. Detailed diagrams of footwork patterns, frame-by-frame breakdowns of specific combinations. One note, dated March 15, 1968, reads, "Robinson's pivot, not just defensive, creates new centerline. Opponent must readjust entire strategy in 0.3 seconds." It was the work of a scientist studying a master craftsman. It wasn't until years later that martial arts historians began noticing the similarities, and students recognized techniques they had learned as adaptations of Robinson's methods. The students never knew they were learning from a boxer who had been retired before their teacher became famous. Today, in mixed martial arts, you can still see Robinson's DNA, Anderson Silva's evasion, McGregor's precision over power. None of these fighters know they're using techniques perfected by a 160-pound boxer from the 1940s. But Bruce Lee knew. He saw the future of fighting in old footage. By then, both men were dead, but the principles Robinson had demonstrated lived on in every martial artist influenced by Bruce Lee's teaching. Muhammad Ali represented something different in Bruce Lee's thinking. Ali was the showman. the entertainer who made boxing accessible to mainstream audiences. Bruce Lee appreciated Ali's cultural significance and athletic achievements. But when Bruce Lee needed to understand how combat actually functioned at the mechanical level, he turned to a different source. The distinction was crucial. Toley had mastered boxing within his era, utilizing his specific physical gifts to maximum advantage. His techniques worked because Ali possessed extraordinary speed, reach, and athletic intelligence. Robinson had mastered something deeper, the underlying principles of boxing itself, creating systematic approaches that transcended individual physical attributes. Robinson's techniques worked because they were based on mechanical principles that could be understood, practiced, and adapted by others. For a teacher like Bruce Lee, Robinson's systematic approach was far more valuable than Ali's individual brilliance. Bruce Lee needed concepts he could pass on to students with varying physical abilities and limitations. Robinson provided those concepts. This is why Bruce Lee's favorite boxer wasn't Muhammad Ali. Ali represented the result of systematic training, fame, success, recognition, cultural impact. Robinson represented the process itself. Nias, how to think about fighting, how to make technique serve strategy, how to win through understanding, rather than just physical advantages. Bruce Lee was never particularly interested in being entertaining. Though his films certainly entertained millions of people, he was interested in being effective. He wanted to understand what actually worked in combat and why it worked, regardless of how it looked or whether it fit traditional expectations. For that kind of education, he needed a teacher who had spent decades perfecting effectiveness without concern for style or showmanship. Sugar Ray Robinson had been that teacher, even though they never met. But Robinson taught Bruce Lee control, not speed. The lightning-fast techniques that made Bruce Lee famous came from a much darker source. There was another fighter Bruce Lee studied obsessively, a man whose techniques were so dangerous they were banned from competition. The story of how Bruce Lee learned to move faster than the human eye has never been told until now.